Hi everyone, my name is Gabriel and this is the Hour of the Raven, your channel for everything Ravenloft, RPG, Dungeons & Dragons and horror. Today we are going to deepen our studies of Werebeasts and discuss in detail the pathology of the infection and the different phenotypes and variations of lycanthropy catalogued by monster hunters and scholars. Although Werebeasts are classic monsters in Dungeons & Dragons, in the Ravenloft campaign setting, these creatures receive great attention and development in order to become unique and complex opponents. The main book with information about these creatures is the Van Richten's Guide to Werebeasts, an in-depth study of the beasts that lurk under the skin and face of mankind, and one in a series of tomes about the horrors that inhabits the lands of the mists. This video will not focus on game mechanics, but will draw directly from the lore of old books about these creatures in Ravenloft, especially the 2nd edition of Dungeons & Dragons. If you play 5th edition, you will notice that there are some differences in the approach of Werebeasts, but this video can be a source of information or inspiration to create new, depth and dangerous villains and enemies for your campaign. In this video, we will explore aspects of the pathology of the lycanthropy infection, ways to cure this condition, and the different phenotypes found for these creatures. Are you ready? As we cross the frontier from Richmulo to Mordant, our studies of lycanthropy are nearing the end, and we deepen our understanding of these creatures and the pathology they transmit. Will we ever manage to find a cure for the cursed condition that afflicts us? Hour of Raven. Pathological lycanthropy is perhaps the most terrifying known supernatural disease. Individuals who have somehow been injured or come into contact with another lycanthrope's bodily fluid becomes host to a terrifying killer beast, which will invade, transform, and take over their bodies to feed on those around them. Understanding the nature of this pathology is the first step for those who wish to get rid of this evil condition or save the lives of those who have become victims of these monsters. Lycanthropy is a pathology that affects living sentient humanoid creatures. However, it is not possible to state that every creature that has a humanoid body shape is susceptible to this disease. There are no records, for instance, that the mythical race of giants can be infected by lycanthropy, which may be a sign that the pathological agent is not capable of infecting a large-scale creature. Other creatures, albeit humanoid in appearance, but inherently magical or supernatural in nature, also seem to be immune to this condition, such as Fey, elemental, celestial, or infernal creatures. Among the humanoid races, humans, half-elves, elves, dwarves, gnomes, halflings, and kenders are susceptible to lycanthropy, but records indicate that other less common races in the lands of the mists can also suffer from this pathology, such as orcs, half-orcs, ogres, trolls, goblins, gnolls, kobolds, and even sahuagins. Although most humanoid races are vulnerable to infections from all phenotypes, the research of Dr. Rudolf van Richten indicates that some races are more vulnerable to certain phenotypes and are more resistant to infections from other types of werebeasts. Kobolds, for instance, are highly resistant to lycanthropy infections, but are vulnerable to infections caused by werebats or wererats, and the aquatic sahuagins are vulnerable to infections caused by wereshark or werseal phenotypes. The transmission of a pathologic infection always transforms the victims into a werebeast of the same phenotype as the creature that infected him. In addition to transmitting the corresponding phenotype, a werebeast also transfers to its victim the same transformation trigger. Thus, a werebeast whose involuntary transform when catching a glimpse of the moon, or hearing the sound of a child's cry, will transfer to the infected victim the same trigger of involuntary transformation. It is important to note that although a natural werebeast has absolute control over its transformation, it does have an inert transformation trigger inherited from its parents, and its victims will always inherit the same trigger condition from their infections. A topic of great debate and curiosity among occult scholars and academics is the possibility of multiple infections. Can an individual be infected by more than one lycanthropy phenotype? This topic of studies offers great challenges to scholars, given the difficulty in obtaining the ideal condition for tests and experiments. Ancient tales told by bards from the land of Carthage relate a case of a victim who had been infected by a werebear and a werewolf and became a deranged and uncontrolled aberration who had elements of both phenotypes in his monstrous form. However, the monster hunter and researcher Dr. Rudolf van Richten believes such tale to be nothing more than the invention of creative bards. His research indicates that an individual who suffers from multiple infections from different werebeast phenotypes will always transform into a single phenotype, depending on the pathological agent responsible for his first transformation into a monster. However, the occurrence of multiple infections may transmit to the victim the transformation triggers of both werebeasts who infected him, and leaves the victim more susceptible to involuntary transformations. One of the great challenges for the proper treatment of a pathological werebeast is finding a way to detect the infection before the first transformation occurs. Until now, advances in studies in this area have not identified any safe way of identifying an infection prior to the transformation. Signs of redness and swelling in wounds caused by a werebeast are pointed as signs of lycanthropy contamination, but a myriad of different causes can make battle wounds become infected. Legends and folklore are rich in detection methods, such as bathing a wound in holy water or testing the victim for allergies to different materials, but none of those have been confirmed by serious occult scholars. Perhaps the only method of effectively discerning whether the victim has been infected is through the mystical divination, but even these methods cannot be completely trusted. In the grim land of the mists, divinations prove sometimes to be misleading or enigmatic, and even divine revelations are sometimes intercepted by the dark powers or other sinister forces. Curing the affliction of lycanthropy, while possible, proves to be a major challenge. Although travelers' accounts and legends from distant worlds claim this condition can be cured by powerful clerical magic, in the land of the mists, this infection takes roots more deeply in the infected individual's soul. For maledictive werebeasts, healing is possible as long as the conditions for reversing the curse are met. No curse can claim hold of a target without a condition for which the victim may redeem himself for his sins, and such escape clauses can be as varied as the curses that were cast. However, breaking a curse can be very difficult, and it always involves a great sacrifice or penance for the cursed. The process of healing a pathological lycanthropy involves a complex ritual that only can be attempted once. For the ritual to be successful, however, certain conditions must be met. The first step in making a cure possible involves the destruction of the natural or cursed werebeast who started the infected lineage. Only with the destruction of this creature that first started the trail of infection can the pathologic werebeast have any hope of a cure. Discovering the identity of the natural werebeast who started a strain of the infection is hard work and involves a considerable amount of investigation. You must first identify the exact moment and conditions under which an individual was contaminated, to track down the creature that infected him. Afterwards, a careful observation of the werebeast that has spread the infection is necessary to identify if this is a natural werebeast or another pathologic werebeast. If the monster is another pathologic werebeast, hunters and investigators must now search for the lycanthrope that has infected this werebeast until they find the end of this chain of monsters. These investigations often run into a dead end, and it's not uncommon for infected lycanthropes to accept their fate and live with their condition, or to be exterminated by the monster hunters who were aiding them to find a cure. Once the natural or cursed werebeast that gave birth to the pathological lineage is destroyed, an infected individual must undergo a process of purification of his spirit and punishment for the evils he committed while transformed into a beast. The second stage must be carried out voluntarily by the infected individual, and the nature of the atonement for the sins must correspond to the gravity of the harm caused by the creature. Individuals who have been infected for a long time accumulate a large amount of evil deeds to atone for, and they may have to devote themselves more deeply to this process. The nature of the atonement for the sins will vary from individual to individual, and at times the help of a religious tradition can help individuals of faith to seek a way to cleanse their spirits from the taint of their sins. When an infected lycanthrope has finally purified his soul, he can attempt to undergo the ritual to remove the blemish of lycanthropy. This ritual poses a great risk to the victim and can only be attempted once, requiring the assistance of powerful clerics. The first step in a ritual is to imprison the pathologic werebeast, restricting his movements. After he is properly contained, the ritual celebrants must induce the victim's transformation trigger, as the ritual must be performed on his bestial and monstrous form. After the transformation, when the beasts take control, the clerics must cast 3 divine spells on the creature in immediate sequence: Atonement, Cure Disease, and Remove Curse. The Atonement spell will complete the soul cleansing, and will only work if the victim has already taken steps to atone for his crimes as a werebeast and purify his spirit. After casting this spell, if it is successful, the individual's mentality will temporarily return and retake control of his body, even in its monstrous form. He must then remain immobile to receive the next sequence of spells. The Cure Disease spell will remove the infected agent of lycanthropy from the victim's body, and ultimately the Remove Curse spell will cleanse the victim's body and soul of the lycanthropy's intangible and supernatural effects. Once the Remove Curse spell is cast, the victim's body will undergo a violent and painful transformation and regress to his original humanoid form. This process is extremely agonizing, and the victim must remain absolutely immobile, maintaining his self-control. Otherwise, he will interrupt the healing at a crucial moment and remain forever in an intermediate animalistic form and in terrible pain. If any step of the healing process is not followed correctly, the healing will fail, and the victim is forever doomed to be a werebeast. In these cases, it is often recommended that the clerics involved in the ritual exterminate the individual, sparing him and those around him from the suffering caused by lycanthropy. Having concluded our studies on the pathological lycanthropy, it is time to look into the different werebeast phenotypes that have already been recorded and catalogued by arcanists and scholars of the occult, to briefly list their habits and vulnerabilities. Perhaps the most widespread phenotype of werebeasts in the land of the mists is the werewolves, humanoids that transform into creatures of the wolf phenotype. Natural werewolves have intermediate social behavior and can be found either as lone predators or walking in groups linked by family ties and led by the strongest members of the pack. In regions such as the lands of Werebeasts, large communities of natural and infected werewolves can be found, with different patterns of behavior and organization, forming a society around the cult of the wolf god. These creatures are only vulnerable to silver or magic weapons, and usually suffer from fatal alchemical allergy to wolfsbane or aconite. Perhaps the most dangerous variation of the werewolf phenotype is the feared loup-garou, a stronger and more resilient specimen of these creatures. A loup-garou is always a natural werebeast, but its size and strength are greater than that of an ordinary werewolf. In their hybrid form, they are over 2 meters tall, and their animal form is always dire in size. These creatures have great strength and are resistant to magic. Silver weapons can hurt them, but magic weapons only deal damage equal to their magic bonus, and blessed weapons only deal 1 point of damage. They are also able to control transformed pathologic werebeasts that were infected through their bites. A variation of the loup-garou, the mountain loup-garou, is found only in mountainous regions and is a solitary predator. He is even more resistant to magic and can regenerate his wounds, but instead of silver, only weapons made of gold can harm them. A maledictive type of werewolf is also featured in our studies. The dangerous loup du noir are individuals who actively seek mystical ways to transform themselves into werewolves and manage to assume animal form when wearing the skin of a wolf. These individuals can only assume the animal form of the wolf when wearing the wolf skin, usually transformed into an animal of dire size. These creatures maintain their intellect while in their animal form, but in their human form, their judgment begins to be clouded by bloodlust. Each day that passes without a transformation to satiate their animal hunger, these individuals grow more and more violent until they give in to the impulse of transformation. Loup du noir doesn't have chemical vulnerability, and even magic weapons only deal half damage to them, unless they are made of silver or have been blessed. They can transmit lycanthropy through the wounds they cause, and can bear offspring with other wolves who are born as wolf-wearers. Werebadgers are a lycanthrope phenotype that seems to propagate more easily among the dwarven race. In their humanoid form, victims of this lycanthropy phenotype exhibit white, almost silvery strands in their hair or beard, but once again, these are common characteristics, and them alone are not sufficient to ensure that an individual is a werebadger. In their animal form, they resemble gigantic badgers, and in their hybrid form they become monstrous bipedal badgers, with huge sharp claws. These creatures are solitary werebeasts, and inhabit the fringes of society, meeting only for mating if they are true werebeasts. Werebadgers are vulnerable to silver and magical weapons, and their chemical vulnerability is the poppy seed and the oil that is extracted from them. The most infamous monster of this phenotype is Azrael Dark, the former seneschal of Lord Soth and current king of Sidicus. Werebeasts are one of the few lycanthrope phenotypes capable of taking flight, and become extremely difficult to track. The sightings and signs of attacks of these creatures are also commonly associated with vampires, making it difficult for them to be clearly identified. The humanoid form of these werebeasts develop over time characteristics typical of their phenotype, such as aversion to light, excellent night vision, and an appetite for raw and bloody meat. Its animal form is that of a gigantic vampire bat, and its hybrid form is a hideous mixture of a humanoid and a bat. Natural werebeasts are social lycanthropes and often choose caves as wilderness lairs, where they inhabit with a family group. They regard themselves as masters of the night and superior to other creatures that should serve them as blood sources. They can be wounded by piercing silver weapons or magical weapons, and their chemical vulnerability is a skullcap. The mighty werebear is one of the strongest phenotypes among lycanthropes. In the humanoid form, many report that they also become more muscular and acquire body hair. Its animal form is that of a gigantic bear, and its hybrid form is that of an imposing monster that blends bear-like aspects with the humanoid pose. Natural werebears tend to use weapons such as axes, which become even more lethal with their brutal force, and have a solitary pattern of behavior, gathering only for mating and rearing young. They are very territorial and tend to build homes far from large urban centers. Legends from distant worlds attest that these creatures are noble and good, but the veracity of these claims cannot be proven in the lands of the mists. These creatures can only be wounded by weapons forged in cold iron, and are chemically vulnerable to belladonna. Wereboars are lycanthropes who transform into gigantic wild boars, or grotesque hybrid monsters that walk in a crunched posture. Some attest that pathological wereboars gain muscle and fat in their humanoid form, and that their hair thickens like the fur of a wild boar. These monsters are fierce fighters and are easily angered. Natural werebeasts of this phenotype adopt a pattern of social behavior, and often live in communities linked by family ties. They are immune to common weapons, and can only be harmed by magic weapons or oaken spears. Their chemical vulnerability is camphor. One of the rare non-mammalian phenotypes, were crocodiles are terrifying and treacherous enemies. They can take the form of giant crocodiles, or become a grotesque hybrid form. These creatures are very strong and brutal in their attacks. Natural were crocodiles use their humanoid form to lure their victims into the vicinity of swamps, before transforming into a monster, to gain an advantage against their prey. Natural were crocodiles are social creatures, and maintain communities linked by family ties and led by their strongest member. They often build homes in swampy regions, on the fringes of society, and many rumors attest that these creatures worship ancient deities with reptilian aspects. They are vulnerable to magical weapons and weapons made of flint, and the chemical vulnerability is the mandrake. The lycanthropy that encompasses the fox phenotype affects more easily the elven race and is more prevalent among females. The humanoid form of these werebeasts is usually extremely beautiful, elegant, and seductive. Its animal form is that of a huge fox, and its hybrid form, though terrifying, appears to be less grotesque than that of a werewolf or other lycanthropes of canid phenotypes. Natural werefoxes are solitary and self-centered creatures, and tend to surround themselves with luxury and comfort. Even if they build homes in remote areas, their lairs will be full of objects that give them pleasure and comfort. In their humanoid form, these creatures use their beauty to exert a supernatural influence and enchant people of the opposite sex, whom they manipulate to achieve their goals, hide their identity, or for their own protection. These creatures are vulnerable to magic weapons or weapons made from canid bones, and are chemical vulnerable to juniper berries. The hyena phenotype of werebeasts plague more arid and desert areas. These creatures can take the form of a giant hyena or a grotesque hybrid monster. The humanoid form is generally charismatic and engaging, and many believe they can exert a supernatural influence on the moods of those around them, to gain the trust of their victims. Natural were-hyenas have an intermediate social behavior. Although they live in bands led by the strongest member, they are extremely territorial and will defend themselves against invaders, even from the same phenotype. These creatures are vulnerable to weapons made of iron or magic weapons. Although their chemical vulnerability is unknown, it is known that they have a great fear of fire and tend to shy away from the presence of flames. Lycanthropes of the jackal phenotype originate from the remote domain of Harakia. They can take the form of a great jackal or a monstrous hybrid form between man and beast. This phenotype is believed to have arisen from a powerful ancient curse, and many natural were-jackals worship a deity called Anubis, and some of them are clerics receiving divine blessings. Lycanthropes infected by the bites of a were-jackal Anubis priest have a chance to become slaves to the will of the natural Werebeast, and are used as slaves to build temples in honor of Anubis. These creatures are known for their cowardice, and they don't hesitate to flee if their lives are threatened. They are vulnerable to magical weapons and weapons made of bronze, and their chemical vulnerability is to phenol. Lycanthropes of the jaguar phenotype often inhabit dense jungles and are silent and terrifying predators. They are only able to take the hybrid form between a humanoid form and a jaguar. Natural were-jaguars have an intermediate social pattern. Although they live in groups, they are extremely territorial and do not hesitate to hunt down those who invade their territory. These creatures are vulnerable to magical weapons and weapons made from the ebony tree. Their chemical vulnerability is unknown, but they are quite fearful of fire. Another lycanthrope phenotype that derives from felines is the were-leopards, who inhabit more arid regions. These creatures can assume hideous hybrid forms and are known for their ferocity and great speed. Natural were-leopards are social animals and tend to hunt in groups, circling and trapping their prey. These monsters can subdue the will of a pathological lycanthrope when transformed, and often use these unfortunate individuals to achieve their goals. They are vulnerable to magic weapons and silver weapons, and their chemical vulnerability is unknown. Were-panthers are a very common lycanthropy phenotype in the lands of Valakan. They can assume the form of dire panthers or hybrid forms. It is said that natural were-panthers can be identified in their humanoid form due to their odd yellowish eyes with vertical and feline irises, and that they are also able to control regular panthers. Natural were-panthers tend to adopt intermediate social behavior. In Valakan, numerous of the pathologic were-panthers become the guard known as the Black Leopards, an elite force of Baron Yurik von Kharkov that appears to exert a supernatural influence over his soldiers. Were-panthers are vulnerable to magical weapons, and silver weapons only deal half damage to these monsters. Their chemical vulnerability is unknown. The dangerous were-rat phenotype is one of the most insidious forms of lycanthropy. These creatures can take the form of huge rats or grotesque hybrid form, slightly smaller than their humanoid form. The behavior of natural were-rats is social, and they gather in large warrens led by a plague king or queen. The domain of Rishmuro houses a large number of these creatures, who infiltrate society and maintain complex games of intrigue and power. Confronting a were-rat is a daunting task. They are vulnerable to magical weapons, and they always have some common material to which they are also vulnerable. However, the type of weapon or chemical vulnerability that can harm a were-rat varies from individual to individual, making hunting these creatures a very difficult task. Were-ravens are one of the rarest and most mysterious phenotypes of lycanthropes. Some believe that these creatures originate from a world called Earth, but this theory cannot be confirmed. They can take the form of huge ravens, or they can transform into hybrid monsters with their upper limbs transformed into black wings that allow them to take flight. Natural were-ravens are mysterious and reclusive, and they live in familiar groups. Legend claims that natural were-ravens are kind creatures and that they help those in need. Other claims that their presence is a clear sign of misfortune. Rumor has it that groups of these creatures live in secret in Barovia and are secretly involved with the Guardians of the Black Feather, a secret society that opposes the evil of Count Strahd. Other claims that they are allies of the Vistani, and that they dress in similar clothing to disguise themselves as one of them. They are vulnerable to silver weapons, and only powerful magical weapons, +2 or better, can harm them. Their chemical vulnerability is not known, but they are said to have an uncontrollable fascination for shiny objects. One of the strangest and most exotic lycanthrope phenotypes is the were-ray. These unusual creatures always inhabit islands or coastal regions, and can take the form of a gigantic manta ray, or a monstrous hybrid form. In this monstrous form, their back looks like rubber wing-shaped fins like a manta ray, but viewed from the front, they still have an humanoid shape, with face, torso and legs attached to this cloak, but with arms that still stand out. In their humanoid form, some attest that these creatures show some signs of their condition, having grayer, thicker and more rubbery skin, like the hide of these animals, and their irises always turn black. These monsters can breathe underwater when transformed, and usually hunt in water. Their victims are usually sailors, fishermen or swimmers. They hide easily in the sands and attack with their whip-like tail. The stingers inject a neurotoxin that, in addition to causing great pain, paralyzes its victims and allows them to devour their prey while they are drowning. Natural were-rays have an intermediate social pattern and live in small groups. These creatures are vulnerable only to magical weapons or weapons made from shells and corals, and their chemical vulnerability is unknown. Another lycanthropy phenotype that comes from the deep sea is the wereshark. Wereshark are feast predators and can take the form of gigantic sharks or hybrid forms that maintain functional limbs. These creatures are efficient and vicious predators, and in the oceans they can reach great speed and try to surprise their victims. Their staggering size as animal or hybrid monster allows them to attempt to swallow medium-sized victims whole, and it's not uncommon for creatures to be devoured in this way, or maimed from a confrontation with these monsters. Pathologic weresharks, unless they are of an aquatic humanoid race, such as sea elves or saurians, always inhabit on islands or near the coast. Natural weresharks adopt a solitary and very territorial behavior, and can manage to command other common sharks to join them in their hunts. These monsters are only wounded by magic weapons, silver weapons, or weapons made of petrified wood, and are chemically vulnerable to mangrove trees. Another lycanthrope creature that inhabits coastal regions and islands is the were-seal. Were-seal can take the form of a gigantic seal, near 2.5 meters in length, or a hybrid form in which the monster has seal aspects but a humanoid body. Natural were-seals develop heightened senses, and some believe they can even perceive the spirit world, unveil illusions, and see a creature's true form. Natural were-seals also adopt a solitary behavior, and live in isolation or in small groups of creatures of the same sex. which only seek out other groups for mating purposes during the hottest periods of the year. These lycanthropes are vulnerable to magical weapons or weapons made from bones and teeth of whale, and are chemically vulnerable to aconite. Perhaps one of the most bizarre and rare phenotypes of lycanthropy, and the only record phenotype that comes from an invertebrate animal, is the were spider. Some believe that these creatures, in their humanoid form, develop long fingers, suitable for climbing walls. These rare creatures can assume the animal form of a gigantic spider, over 2 meters long, or a horrendous hybrid form, with humanoid appearance that are augmented by arachnid limbs, and deformations of its face in which new eyes and venomous jaws appear. In their animal or hybrid form, they can scale walls and cast powerful webs upon their enemies. These creatures have a powerful bite capable of inoculating a lethal poison, and also can insert eggs into the skin of their victims. Lycanthropy is not bested by the simple blow of its fangs, but by the hatch of these eggs under the skin of the victims, which contaminate their blood with the pathogen. Natural were spiders are solitary creatures that only reunite for breeding purposes. They are vulnerable to magic and silver weapons, and their chemical vulnerability is unknown. One of the most dangerous phenotypes of lycanthropy, were-tigers are found in large numbers in the Zrihagir domain and in the wildlands. These creatures can take the form of a large tiger or a hybrid mixture of humanoid and tiger, making them a dangerous and lethal predator. The pathogen that affects this phenotype seems to contaminate the female gender more easily, and there is a greater number of female were-tigers. The social behavior of were-tigers can be classified as intermediary, as they live in groups linked by family or affinity ties, but they are quite violent in defending their territories. These creatures are vulnerable to magical or obsidian weapons, and chemically vulnerable to ginseng. The were serpents, or were cobras, is a rare phenotype of lycanthropy, and its individuals are sometimes confused with the mythical race of the Yuan-Ti. In their humanoid form, lycanthropes of these phenotypes appear to develop great magnetism and attraction, and demonstrate agility and delicacy in their movements. They can take the form of a giant snake or a hybrid form, with the body covered in scales and with venomous fangs, which can either be bipedal or endowed with a long tail. In their animal or monstrous form, these werebeasts can inoculate powerful poisons with their fangs. Natural were serpents adopt intermediate social behavior. While it is not uncommon to find solitary were cobras, rumors suggest that large numbers of these lycanthropes can gather to coexist in secret in urban centers. These lycanthropes are vulnerable to magical weapons and weapons made of ivory, and their chemical vulnerability is unknown. The werecats are stealthy and skittish predators. Many claim that these creatures, while in their humanoid form, act elegantly and are often quite seductive, selfish, and indulgent. They can take the form of an ordinary cat, or a monstrous hybrid appearance, usually very similar to their humanoid form, but with their body covered in fur and the facial features transformed into a feline look. The natural werecats adopt a solitary behavior pattern, but it is rumored that these creatures can band together in societies when their personal interests converge. These monsters can be harmed by magic or silver weapons, and their chemical vulnerability is unknown. Many other lycanthrope phenotypes have been reported, but there has been no sighting or confirmation of their presence by occult scholars. The silent and dangerous were owl, the mighty and proud were lion, the underground were mole, the ape-like were gorilla, and even the legendary were dragon to this day have their existence contested by scholars and arcanists. Perhaps even more sinister and unknown horrors roam the wide regions of the world in search of new prey. As we complete our studies of lycanthropy, the weight of our discoveries crushes our spirits. The cure for our condition now seems remote and distant. When we were infected in Burbrack, we were surrounded by many werewolves. Which one would have infected us with lycanthropy? Would the brief combat we waged and the strength of our spells have been enough to exterminate the beast that contaminated us? How could we purify our souls of the harm we do in our woe form? And where we will find clerics willing to carry out the dangerous ritual of healing? We must continue our search for the assistance of the renowned Dr. Rudolf von Richten, a scholar and monster hunter, and the priestess of Hala and their auspices of healing. All these questions plague our minds when we reach a crossroad in the road to Mordant. A low mist seems to emerge from a nearby swamp, and the distant wind seems for a moment to sound like a cry or a wail. What secrets this new domain might hold? Subscribe to this channel and activate notifications, and join us as we travel through the domain of Mordant, exploring its ancient and haunted villages, manors, forests, and swamps.